Hello everyone, this is Tremagan. Welcome to our course, Purposive Communication. In today's video, I will discuss the third lesson, which is about the language barriers. When we see language barriers, these are the things that hinder the communication process. To some, they call it or they refer it as the noise because it's the noise that is the common barrier or the most common barrier in the process of communication. But let me use the broader term, which is the barrier of communication. You will find this in the Shannon-Weaver model of communication, wherein as the statement from or the message from the sender passes through the channel, there are barriers before it reaches the receiver. So this time, let us focus on these types of barriers that exist or you may have experienced as you get through this process. Allow me to share my PowerPoint presentation with you for easier understanding. All right, as you can see on the screen, there is the title, Communication Barriers, and there are two women here trying to converse, but there is this wall between them, and this wall symbolizes the barriers of their communication. If you're going to search about the barriers in the internet, you will find this. And these are just some of the barriers of communication, but it's not yet complete. Maybe you have experienced other barriers. Now we have physical barriers, attitude, emotional, cultural, language, gender barriers, lack of focus and eye contact, fear of mistakes, psychological barriers, perceptual barriers, and feedback issues. Again, these are not yet complete, but you could still find other barriers. Now, these barriers are categorized into major groups, and in this slide, you will see the five categorization of the barriers, starting with the language barriers, psychological barriers, physiological, physical, and cultural barriers. Let us begin with the first one, the language barriers. And the language barriers are classified into two, the semantic and syntactic. When we say semantic language barriers, these are the barriers out of the wrong or inappropriate choice of word because semantics is more of the words themselves. And under semantic, we have the jargons. Jargons is a language that is shared by a group of people that, for example, we teachers have our list of terms that only we can understand. Now, if you are not a teacher like us, then you may not be able to understand these terms that we know. So that's an example of how jargons appear as the language, as the barrier in communication. Also, abbreviations also are considered semantic language barriers because when you make use of a lot of abbreviations in your communication and these abbreviations are not familiar with the person you're talking to, then there is a language barrier. Another is the regional colloquialism or and expression, and this one is, um, is composed of the words of one region that is not known or popular to other regions. For example, I am living in region 4B, so Mimaropa region, but if you are from a place in Mindanao, then we share different dialects. Ours is Tagalog, yours is different. And the words and expressions that we use in our day-to-day conversation or communication may not be familiar to you. And if I'm going to use this colloquialism that only Mindoreños understand, then there could be a barrier in communication, and that is considered the language barrier, specifically the semantic barrier. Next is the syntactic. This is derived from the term syntax. And when we say syntax in English language, this is the construction of sentences. When we try to arrange the words to come up or to construct a complete sentence or a paragraph. Now, if there is an error in sentence construction, let's say um, in grammar, then language barrier may occur or arise. There could be miscommunication or misunderstanding only because of grammatical errors. Let's move to the second, which is the psychological barriers. Psychological barriers, we have these three examples. It's about attitude, behavior, and emotional state. If you have a problem with your attitude and you're trying to communicate with others, and in the first place, you don't want to listen or you don't ever agree with anyone, then this could be a psychological barrier. It's in your own mindset, it's in your own attitude. Next is your behavior. Of course, your problem with your attitude or with your mind is reflected by your behavior, and this is also considered a psychological barrier. Next is the emotional state. Our words are affected by our emotional state. You observe how you communicate when you are so angry. When you're angry, sometimes we tend not to listen anymore to the people we're talking to, especially if you're angry with that person. And that is a psychological barrier. Now, if you are so excited with what happened, let's say you suddenly won in a lottery and you are in a class, probably you may not be able to absorb all the learnings that your teacher is trying to inform or to let you know because you are that mindset or in that verge of happiness and excitement that your focus is on what you're going to spend or how are you going to spend the money that you just won. All those are examples of psychological barrier. Now we have the physiological barriers of communication, and this refers to the limitations of human body and human mind. When we say human body, this one is about the physical human body. For example, are the physical conditions, disabilities, poor retention. For the physical conditions, let's say you are talking to someone who's deaf or someone who's not able to listen or to hear anything and you don't know how to use or to do sign languages. Of course, that is a physiological barrier because you're talking to someone who cannot hear your words. Next is the disabilities. It's also related to that, and poor retention. Now, for the physical conditions, I almost forgot that it is also about how you feel physically. If you are in pain, let's say you got wounded just earlier before you communicate, then it's also a barrier because when you're in pain and you're talking to someone, your focus might be on the feeling of pain that you're hurting instead of listening and absorbing what the other one is telling you. And also, physiological barriers are when you are hungry. Let's say you're attending your 3 p.m. class inside the classroom, and while your teacher is discussing, you are so hungry, and instead of listening to her or his words, your mind is like thinking about the food that you will eat after the class and something about your imagination out of your hunger. Again, this is physiological, barriers are about the limitations of human body and human mind. Also for retention when you are just talking to someone who can't remember or who has problems with memory retention. Next, we have the physical barriers. Physical barriers are also called the environment barriers because it is about the physical environment of the people who are communicating with each other. And one common example is the distance. When you are talking to someone who's very far from you, the tendency is you will not be able to listen or to hear the words that each other is throwing. However, to overcome this, you simply shout at each other, and it also affects negatively the process of communication. Aside from the distance, we have the noise. It's very common, or the most common of all the barriers. If you are in a crowd and the crowd, let's say you are in a concert with so many audience and you are trying to communicate with the person beside you, then you will really struggle in your communication because it's too noisy around you. And now that we are in pandemic, even in classes, it's done virtually. And one of the most common physical barriers in this setup or in our way of communicating these days is the technical problem. when the signal is poor, or when suddenly there is um, a power interruption or something like that. These are all physical barriers. And lastly, we have the cultural barriers where we can easily understand that if culture is the one involved in the barrier of communication, then it's a cultural barrier. We have different cultures, and therefore we have different cultural backgrounds and differences as well. And because of this, sometimes our communication is affected negatively. For example, in terms of eating, in Japan, when you eat your soup with this loud sound or noise, it is your way of appreciating the person who cooked it. Like it's delicious when you eat it that way. However, that is not proper if I mean not proper to do if you are here in the Philippines or in the United States, because that shows lack of manners and something like that. So because of these cultural differences, it also affects the communication. Next is stereotype. When we say stereotype, this is overgeneralizing the people or the idea of this person only because you just know someone who is like that from that nation. For example, based from what I saw in social media, if we say Pakistani, I mean someone from the Middle East, they have this stereotyping that they are the people who don't take a bath daily. Again, this is just out of my observation on social media. Now, that is an example of stereotype because not all from the Middle East do not take a bath daily. Some are also vain or, I mean, have this good hygiene. But since this is a stereotype, if you know one or three from that region, you already have this thinking or overgeneralizing that all these people from the Middle East do not take a bath daily. So that is a bad way of dealing with people or thinking about them. Next is racism. Racism is pretty evident with the black people and the Asians. We Asians experience this racism whenever we go to other places, especially in the Western countries. And we have also heard the saddening news that many Asians and the black people are experiencing racism just because of their nationality, just because of their skin color. So these are considered cultural barriers. Now, for example, if you are a racist, you never wish to talk to someone who is, you think, below or inferior to your culture. So that is racism. Now let's have these tips or what you need to consider to overcome these communication barriers. First is the use of simple language. So this one is to address the language barriers. If you are talking to someone who you think, or let's say the kids who are just learning the basic language or the basic English, then you are not supposed to use the highfalutin English words, or else you will not be understood by them. Next is the reduction and elimination of noise levels. If you want to have a heart-to-heart talk to someone, to communicate deeply with anyone, of course, you don't go to a crowd where it's noisy. So you look for a place that you think is quiet for you to be, you know, um, be heard and be listened at. Next is active listening. If you're communicating, it's very important that you listen actively for you not to miss any important word or any part of the message. Because if you don't listen actively, there could be misinterpretations all throughout the process. Next is when it comes to your emotional state, we are not supposed to communicate with people when we are at the verge of anger. When we are so angry, because the tendency here is you don't communicate at all. You just speak, you just say words that will surely hurt the other person. And that is um, not going to be an effective communication. If you let your emotional state affect your conversation. And the proper media selection. So this one is true when communication is held virtually. You have to consider the most appropriate media platform to use, and you should also consider what is this platform or site that will not cause any technical problem as you have your exchange of information. Also, you may overcome the barriers of communication by first checking whether it is a good time and place to communicate with the person. Can you imagine if you just want to joke around to talk about nonsense things and you're gonna call someone at midnight or even like 2 a.m.? So I don't think that's a good time because at that time, people are expected to be taking their rest and sleeping, and then you're gonna meddle and just disturb their sleep, well, that's not good, or else there will really be misunderstanding or your relationship with that person may be affected. It depends upon, of course, your purpose. If that is very urgent and important, then it could be acceptable. Also, you have to choose a nice place to communicate. Next is being clear and using language that the person understands. Now, if you are in, other country and you don't know how to speak the language that they are using there, let's say in Indonesia, you're a Filipino and you go to Indonesia, you don't speak there or you don't communicate there using your native language, which is Filipino language. Instead, they have to consider what language do they understand so that you can have this smooth communication. Next is communicating one thing at a time. You have to focus first on one subject because if you communicate with different people, different topics, then there could be confusions or miscommunication among you. Next is respecting a person's desire to not communicate. We don't force anyone to talk to us if they don't want to, or else there could be a negative consequence. That's it. And acknowledging any emotional responses that the person has to what you have said. Again, you have to respect and acknowledge that everyone could have different interpretations and response, emotional response towards what you said. Now, if you joke around and the person did not laugh, then probably there is something beyond her or his reaction. And if he or she responded negatively, then you have to reconsider and think about what you have said. Maybe that's offensive or not. So these are the ways to overcome the barriers of communication or barriers to communication that were discussed earlier. And this time I want to try your understanding. So this is true to my students, 1F1 and 1F2. Make sure to answer this activity and of course submit your answer. Here goes the directions. Identify the type of barrier given in each of the following items. So you're just going to choose one from those categories of or the types of communication which were discussed just recently. First is the whirling sound of an electric fan. Second, the leaves. Third, idioms or the idiomatic expressions. Four, service interruptions. Number five, smell of grilled beef. Six, prejudice. Seven, slang. Number eight, hunger. Number nine, family problems. And number 10, poor internet connectivity. So that is it. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And I hope you get a perfect score in the activity that I gave you. So thank you so much once again. And don't forget to submit your answer.